always remember that Jesus said that Satan comes to kill, to rob, and to destroy, but I come, he would say, that you might have life and have it more abundantly. So you never want to take what Jesus says about Satan and apply it to God, because God has never changed. Our condition changed, but God has not changed. But one day, there in your outline, the Pharisees come to Jesus and they ask a question. And it says, some Pharisees came to Jesus testing him and asking, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? Now, before we go any further, keep in mind, this is the Middle East. 2,000 years ago, women had no rights. So the question is it God's will for us to be able to, for any reason, to just divorce our wives? Now, they couldn't get jobs, they couldn't own property, so is it God's will? And so Jesus responds to that question by quoting from Genesis chapter 2. We're going to say, in the Garden of Eden. And it says there in your outline, it says, he answered and said, have you not read that he who, and I've underlined the word, created them from the beginning? Guys, Jesus is God. Jesus believes in creation, that it happened just as God said. He did not believe that it all came into existence by some other process, but he believed in the creation. Then he says, from the beginning, and here he begins to quote from Genesis chapter 2, and that's why the font changes there in your Bibles and on your outline. And he says, from the beginning, made them male and female. And he said, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. Now, here Jesus points back to the creation in the Garden of Eden. He says, here's how God set this up. You and I live in a fallen world. Even though God set it up this way, it doesn't always work out that way. There are some times when people get divorced. There are some times when you need to separate from someone. And so, but that's a story for another day. So we're just talking about what Jesus says as he points back to the creation. So he says, well, you want to know God's will? Just look back at how God created it, how God set it up. So the first filter we're going to look at today, you want to write this down. To know God's will, just look at the garden. You can write the Garden of Eden, however you want. So you ask the question, well, how was it in the Garden of Eden? Because that's how God set it up, and he hasn't changed. In Genesis chapter 3, the next chapter, you know that sin enters the world. When sin enters the world, man's condition changes. Our whole condition changes. But the question is, did God change? Well, God never changed. Man's condition changed. But God's the same, yesterday, today, and forever. So man's circumstances changed, but God did not change. So now you and I live in a fallen world, but again, let me say, God didn't change, our condition changed. So he never changes. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. So if you want to know what God's will is, just look at how God created it. How did he set it up? And it was there in the Garden of Eden. So you look at the Garden of Eden, you ask the question, in the Garden of Eden, did Adam and Eve have not enough, just barely enough, or did they have all they needed? That's not a trick question. Do we have to go back to Genesis? They had all that they needed. Well, here's the thing. Man's condition changed, but God did not change, which is why God came to the earth thousands of years later. Jesus is God in the flesh, and he reveals his will because his will never changes. So you know the story, he feeds the 5,000, and the people were hungry. They had no food, and being hungry and having no food, that was not his will. So what does he do? He supernaturally provides, taking 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and he feeds. And in the original language, it says they ate until they were stuffed. And after they were stuffed, they still picked up 12 baskets of leftovers. So I have in my notes that he is the God of fully stuffed with leftovers. So if you're in a time of lack right now, you never want to say, well, it just must be God's will that we just don't have enough. No, God has not changed. Man's condition has changed, but it's not God's will. So in the garden, would you say in the garden everyone was healthy? Was there any disease in the garden? But we realize that sin entered in and sickness came into the world. So man's condition changed, but here's the question, did God change? He did not change. He never changes. So you can't say, well, maybe the sickness that I have, it's just God's will. No, God did not change. God did not change. You and I live in a fallen world. Sickness takes place, but God has not changed. So you never want to say, well, it must be God's will. Always remember that Jesus said that Satan comes to kill, to rob, and to destroy, but I come, he would say, that you might have life and have it more abundantly. So you never want to take what Jesus says about Satan and apply it to God, because God has never changed. Our condition changed, but God has not changed. Somebody says, we're married, we want to have a baby, but we've been trying, but it's just not happening. And so maybe it's just not God's will for us to have children. Well, wait a minute. What was the first command given to Adam and Eve in the garden? It was be fruitful and multiply. So if it's not happening right now, you don't want to say, well, it must not be God's will. No, God already said, this is my will, be fruitful and multiply. Man's condition changed. Sometimes it doesn't happen, but you don't want to say it must be God's will, because God has already told us what his will is there. So somebody says, well, and I'm getting up in age and I haven't met anybody yet. I'd like to be married, but it just hasn't happened. Maybe it's just God's will that I don't get married. Well, wait a minute. What did God say in the garden? He said, it is not good for man to be alone. If it's not good for man to be alone, guess what? It's not good for woman to be alone. So obviously it's God's will that you meet that person. If it's not happening and you want that, you don't want to start by saying, well, it must be God's will. No, because God has not changed. Man's condition has changed, but it's not God's will. So you always want to remember God's will, God's plan was manifested in the Garden of Eden. In Genesis chapter 3, sin enters in and man's condition changes, but God didn't change. Our condition changed.